Okay, let's start this, again, another perfect day down the tube. Good afternoon. I call to order this hearing of the Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee on the role of Special Operations Forces in the great power competition. The United States is facing a dramatically different geopolitical environment than any other time in recent decades. While this century has been dominated by our efforts in the global war on terrorism, the new era of great power competition presents strategic challenges from revisionist states in China and Russia and their rogue state allies in Iran and North Korea. All the while, the threat from violent extremist organizations persists as nodes from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates continue to seek out unstable regions from which they can plot and plan against Western targets. As the United States faces an inflection point in geostrategic competition, so too does our special operations community. Thankfully, the SOF enterprise is well suited to address the challenges posed by great power competition, where core SOCOM activities such as irregular warfare and the Train, Advise, and Assist mission offer the ability to present strategic and operational challenges to our adversaries and enable our allies and partners to resist outside aggression. Great power competition, in which conventional force capabilities may play a larger role in deterring hostile actions from our state adversaries, similarly means that special operations forces will play more of a supporting and enabling role for the wider joint force. The core functions of the SOF enterprise, when taken together, provide options and capabilities across the entire operational spectrum, from gray zone competition to direct military engagement if the need arises. During this transition, it will be critical for our special operators to continue to hone new skills and expertise in a variety of areas, from critical cultural knowledge and language capabilities to being tactically proficient in the cyber and information space. Today's hearing is focused on the role of special operations forces as the United States enters an era of great power competition. This subcommittee will seek to examine the unique capabilities of SOCOM and how Special Operations Forces core activities may complement and enable the joint force to operate against strategic adversaries. We hope to further understand which skill sets of the SOF community must be relearned after 20-plus years of counterterrorism, and what new skills our special operators must learn to operate in the 21st century gray zone, below the threshold of direct military intervention. Our witnesses today have a breadth of experience with the special operations community and the study of gray zone conflict and irregular warfare. Dr. Seth Jones is the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Jones has also served as a director at the RAND Corporation and has served as a plans officer and advisor to the Commanding General of U.S. Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan. Dr. David Ucko is a professor and department chair at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University, where he oversees the college's irregular warfare area of concentration. In the interest of time, I ask the witnesses to keep their opening remarks to 5 minutes or less so that we will have sufficient time for questions and answers. With that, please let me thank our witnesses for appearing before us today, and I now recognize Ranking Member Gallego for any opening remarks. And oh, by the way, just know the subcommittee chairman and the ranking member both probably look at life from a slightly Marine Corps perspective. So having said that, just keep your words to, simple syllables. We want to be able to understand. Congressman Gallego, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you in a bipartisan manner to continue the great work that we started last year. It's hard to think of a more appropriate topic as we continue our oversight responsibilities at the beginning of this Congress. As I said during last year's SOCOM posture hearing, Special Operations Forces are at an inflection point. The 2022 National Defense Strategy focuses on strategic competition to counter China's growing multi-domain challenges and Russia's persistent aggression, including its ongoing war in Ukraine. SOF have a significant role to play, and in this volatile security environment, should be prioritized. But I want to return to the inflection point I mentioned earlier at the hearing. How are SOF postured to support a whole government approach to great power competition? What is the role in concert with other departments and agencies so that we are using the right instrument of national power for its best purposes? The summary of the Regular Warfare Annex to the National Defense Strategy, published in 2020, tells us that regular warfare is the struggle among state and non-state actors to influence populations and affect legitimacy. This needs to be prioritized as a competency within the joint force and the special operations community. Some of the core activities that are important to regular warfare are ones like foreign international defense and military information support operations, which are essential if we are to be successful in confronting our competitors in the gray zone or below the threshold of armed conflict. My question stands: where does the Special Forces community stand in the core activities needed for irregular warfare? Has the focus on counterterrorism and counter-violent extremist organizations, which has been needed for the last 20 years, caused other aspects of SOCOM's core activities to atrophy? I would argue that the lessons over the last 20 years, as is, don't directly translate to the needs of today or tomorrow. We need to ensure that SOCOM has the right training, institutional education, and authorities to continue to be the best at what this nation asks them to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and I also want to thank our witnesses for their time today, and I look forward to hearing your views.
Thank you, Representative Gallego. We will now hear from our witnesses, then move into question and answer session. So, Dr. Jones, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bergman, Ranking Member Gallego, and distinguished members of the committee. This is an important hearing, and look forward to the discussion afterwards. As I will outline in my testimony, U.S. Special Operations Forces need to play an important role in competition, particularly with such countries as China, Russia, and Iran, including in the area of irregular warfare. My brief remarks are going to cover three areas. The first is irregular warfare, the second is the role of SOF in irregular warfare, and the third are some implications on the congressional side. So let me just say that I think, as has been well documented in the recent National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy, we are in an era of competition with a range of countries, particularly with the Chinese at the top. I would argue, as we have seen historically, we have not had nuclear powers ever go to war directly with each other, in part because states get quite cautious in conventional warfare against other nuclear powers. So the Soviets, even the Chinese and the Indians, or the Indians and Pakistanis, have generally acted with restraint. We have not seen any of those states go to direct conventional war with each other. However, we have still seen intense competition below the threshold of conventional war. So I would argue here today that I consider this area below the threshold of conventional war as probably being the primary area of competition on an hourly and a daily category. As we look at a range of U.S. competitors, the Chinese are very active below this threshold with elements of the People's Liberation Army, the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the Russians with elements of the GRU, the main directorate of the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service, the FSB, several of Russia's special operations forces, including its Spetsnaz, as well as non-state entities, including, as we've seen in the Ukraine, in the Bakhmut area, the Wagner Group and some of the private military companies. And I don't need to say a lot about the Iranians because they are among the quintessential irregular actors with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Quds Force and its relationship with the Lebanese Hezbollah, Popular Mobilization Forces, and others around the Middle East. So I think when we look at the role of SOF in this arena, I think there is a particular role for activities outside of direct action. That has been the mantra over the 20 years after 9/11 of SOF and many of its units. But I think what we're talking about primarily because of the risk of escalation, is a heavy focus on things like foreign internal defense, providing assistance to a range of countries. So think for a moment about aiding the Baltic states or Finland in providing assistance in case of an invasion, Russian invasion. Not imminent at this point, but certainly potentially down the road. Taiwan, in case of an invasion, there is an important component of that the Taiwanese would need to resist, both conventionally, but also in a regular element of that as well. Unconventional warfare, which is the support to non-state entities, non-state partners, a role historically of organizations like the Green Berets, and then a range of other activities, including information operations. Again, my general view is, is that I think there has been a slight misunderstanding of the non-kinetic side of special operations forces, and they have a range of capabilities. When it comes to the role of Congress, I think Congress has a very important role moving forward for SOF, particularly in this area of irregular warfare. My own view is that funding should be considered expanding in the Section 1202 area, potentially also in 333, Section 333, and happy to discuss that. I do think there needs to be a broad review, posture review of the Department of Defense and the interagency role in irregular warfare, and happy to take more specific questions. But as I've argued so far, I think this will be a major form of competition. The Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians are heavily involved in this, and we need to responsibly as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Ucko.
Chairman Bergman, Ranking Member Gallego, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. As we've heard, the United States finds itself in an era of strategic competition. How to respond is now the focus of the U.S. government, but it is a question compounded by the variegated and global method of attack. Indeed, America's rivals are deliberately avoiding U.S. strengths, particularly in the military domain, and instead they privilege ambiguity and subterfuge, blending statecraft with subversion and war with peace. SOF have and can contribute to this competition through its specialization in irregular warfare. In recent years, SOF has broadened its application of foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare to IW missions and SOF core activities to fit this new strategic environment. FID traditionally meant aiding a friendly government against an insurgency, but SOF now looks upon it to boost a country's resilience against foreign-sponsored proxies. UW traditionally implied sponsoring an insurgency against an illicit or occupying government, but SOF now looks upon its work as supporting resistance capabilities for states either facing foreign invasion or seeking to deter such a threat. Building resilience and resistance will be key lines of effort in America's overall approach. Yet they're also highly demanding tasks, requiring institutional readiness and protracted partnerships abroad. There is today a need to rebalance SOF in favor of FID and UW and to harness the skills they call for within this new strategic era. This will mean an emphasis on language skills, cultural know-how, political awareness, and strategic acumen, all at scale, with major implications for SOF recruitment and career tracks. Yet FID and UW are more than military tasks. In FID, the assets trained by SOF must be supported by a capable security sector, undergirded by sustainable institutions, and operating alongside instruments of state that can take the lead on political, societal, and economic matters. In UW, fostering potential for armed resistance must be complemented by a whole-of-society effort to provide a legal framework, engage with allies and partners, build a narrative for mobilization, and win the struggle for legitimacy that is so essential to irregular warfare. This calls for greater interagency coordination and integration even in conducting what many see exclusively as a SOF task. This brings us to the primary non-military nature of strategic competition. Indeed, as our competitors seek to avoid our military strengths, there are clear limits to how much we can and should expect from SOF, still a military force. Responding to weaponized corruption, election interference, media penetration, political infiltration, dodgy trade deals, and infrastructural development will require a far broader portfolio. Even where SOF has relevant capability, for example, its PSYOPs assets, so do other instruments of power, and they must be made to count. This is not only a matter of managing SOF's operational tempo, which has been too high for too long, causing standards to slip. It is also about allowing SOF to master the tasks we expect of them, FID and UW in particular. Thus, where SOF engages in non-military tasks, it should be to increase the reach and effectiveness of civilian agencies. My written testimony sets out useful precedents for such integration at the operational level, which could be scaled up for truly strategic effect. This also means integrating better with general purpose forces for more calibrated division of labor, particularly as concerns security force assistance and persistent partnerships. Now, such partnerships do rely on an interagency and conventional military being able to play their parts within irregular warfare. Thus, I recommend interagency strategic education, training, and sensitization as to the nature of this competition and the roles of different components of state in generating a tailored response. My college, the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University, provides a model for such education that could be scaled up for greater effect. At our campus at Fort McNair here in DC, under the Regional Defense Fellowship Program, we combine senior officials from across the armed services, the intelligence community, the interagency, and partner nations for an education in irregular warfare and associated strategies. The program is partner-oriented, with more than 50% of students coming from abroad. At our MA program at Fort Bragg, civilian academics teach an irregular warfare curriculum to SOF officers and NCOs, alongside international SOF students and State Department personnel. On integration, there's also a key role here for cross-functional teams, liaison officers, and other structural ways of cutting across agencies, thereby enabling awareness and synchronization of respective strengths. The newly formed Irregular Warfare Center could play a leading role in this initiative, as it provides a focal point for irregular warfare and taps into existing networks devoted to this topic. As of the FY23 defense budget, it has been granted authorities to engage and coordinate across the interagency to enhance America's capability for irregular and political warfare. The final need is for greater strategic clarity and long-term planning for strategic competition, to understand what we're both competing for and against. I think this means developing a strategy that proceeds according to a clearly elaborate theory of success, rather than just the means and capabilities at our disposal. I look forward to discussing these issues with you and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And I will defer my questions until last. I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Gallego for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I just have 2 questions, and this is to both of our witnesses. While we're discussing the role of SOF in great power competition, are there some areas that should be left to other departments and agencies? And are there any tasks that SOF should not necessarily do when it comes to great power competition? And that's not necessarily that they can't do it well, but that someone else could probably be doing it better, and we have the opportunity cost issue here. Want to start, Dr. Dotens?
Sure, yes. So I think a range of the skill sets that SOF do get involved in, including information operations. There is a role in MISO that SOF can play, but I think in general, as we look across the U.S. government more broadly, there's a critical role and a leading role for the State Department to play there, including with the Global Engagement Center. When it comes to covert activity, there's certainly a role for the U.S. intelligence community to play. So I would say on some of these areas, SOF and the Department of Defense are not even the leading agency for this, but need to be nested. This does raise questions about to what degree on the information side we are nested more broadly into a broader strategy. And I think we're still a long way away from where we were in the last, say, decade of the Cold War. So that's one. When it comes to providing foreign internal defense, there are key elements, I think, of training foreign forces that are probably better left to Army or Marine Corps forces as well. I think when you're talking about specialized units, your special operations forces, commando units, some civil defense side that would be engaged in responding to a foreign invasion, that's probably where SOF has some comparative advantage. But general, there are SFABs within the Army, for example, that can do broader training. So I think it depends on what kind of foreign military, for example, is training and whether that's better left to SOF or conventional forces.
Seen some of for example, state National Guards going and training other countries, and with a lot of that relationship that normally would have been taken up by special forces, and they're doing it and doing it well, and freeing up our soft elements for something else. Dr. Ucko?
Thank you, Representative Gallego. Yeah, I concur with my colleague here. I would say that on the military or security side, it's absolutely worth mentioning the state partnership program that the National Guard leads up, and the way that that has produced an enduring security cooperation bond with strategically relevant countries. The SFAB initiative, I think, is also a very positive step for the Army, finally recognizing that it too has a role in security force systems and need to actually devote specialized assets to that end. But it's also worth recalling again that great power competition is primarily non-military, and that China and Russia and other actors we're competing with have found a way of carrying out the so-called war of interlocking, that is to say, synchronizing different efforts across different agencies. And we need to be as versatile and as nimble. And on that front, I think that it would be foolish to look to the special operations community as the go-to option in responding to this type of aggression. I'm thinking in particular in terms of countering threat finance. Admittedly, SOF has a burgeoning expertise in this area, but I think it would be unwise to neglect the fact that the Department of Commerce and the OFAC also should have a role to play, and that we need to make sure that our portfolio is as diverse and as specialized, particularly at the strategic level, as that of our adversaries. Thank you.
And Dr. Ucko, you recently proposed a modified definition of irregular warfare. Can you share that with the group and why you believe that is important?
Absolutely. Irregular warfare, ironically, has become more of a talking point since we said goodbye to the so-called war on terror. And yet, of course, that was 20 years of very protracted and very intense involvement in this term. My concern is that in trying to close that chapter, we will now try to redefine irregular warfare as something very different from the experience we had there. To my mind, the definition that was come up in 2007, the joint operating concept, is still absolutely relevant. Irregular warfare then is a violent struggle for legitimacy. It's violent because it is ultimately something that the military is involved in. If we take that away, then irregular warfare becomes pretty much anything China does. And it is a struggle for legitimacy because in this struggle, our need for partnerships and for mobilizing potential and united fronts is key. This is the area where China and Russia are competing extremely heavily. So I wrote this piece on redefining irregular warfare to make sure that we don't lose the lessons, both positive and negative, from the last 2 decades and turn irregular warfare into something that is in fact very alien to its nature. This is still something that we have to deal with, now waged against states rather than non-state actors, but it is an area of more continuity than change.
I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Representative Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ucko, I want to stay on that train of thought, and could you identify briefly, in about 2 minutes so that I can move to Dr. Jones, the key differences in the way Russia and China carry out irregular warfare in their competition?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that, do you mean the difference between the two respective nations or between us and them?
Between the two respective nations.
Right. Thank you, Representative. Yes, I think Russia has emphasized to a greater degree the use of violence, seen most egregiously, of course, in Ukraine, but also previously in Georgia. Also in its engagement on the African continent, its main contribution to those states have been in the security realm, with the deployment of the so-called Wagner Group to provide effectively the role of mercenaries. China, in contrast, has adopted a slightly different role, and I think it is more invested in infrastructural development, economic, financial, and informational lines of effort. That, in a sense, and perhaps paradoxically, I think is a bigger threat, because whereas Russia has played the role of spoiler, China actually threatens to contribute something and to create a new order. That order, I think, is deleterious both to the countries that it is targeting and to the international system that the United States upholds, but it is nonetheless attractive, particularly to elites looking for quick solutions to urgent problems of debt and poverty. So therein lies one difference. And I think going back to the issue of irregular warfare then, what we have to make sure is that we also bring into the fore the notion of political warfare, which of course George Kennan described as the application of a Clausewitzian logic in times of peace. Both Russia and China then bridge the spectrum from conflict to peace, and we need to ensure that while the DoD and the Special Operation Forces have a role in particular to play along that spectrum, we don't lose sight of the other instruments of state that must also be integrated and synchronized to meet the threat where it is active.
So just in summary, China is using debt and infrastructure projects, whereas Russia is using mercenaries in the Wagner Group.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a fair characterization.
The end result is the same, in that the people lose the country.
Yes. I would add one point, which is, of course, that the target's never static. And what Russia did in February of last year will very much inform the way it acts in the future. It would be foolish and I think unrealistic to assume that it won't learn from this strategic error.
Dr. Jones, I want to stay on the issue of African Wagner Group. My friend Jimmy Panetta and I traveled there. I've traveled there several times, but the most recent time we had seen a marked change towards the French on the continent of Africa, in the Lake Chad Basin area in Mali. And it seems that Wagner Group has been extremely successful in the use of social media to drive the general public against the French. There's one, and it's publicly reported, incident where French ISR picked up a mass grave and mass killing that had been carried out, presumably by the Wagner Group. And when the French reported that, before it was ever disseminated to the general public, Wagner had picked up on it and put it out that the French had done that. The end result of that is the public believed what they heard first, and the French were have been asked in some cases to leave the countries. How fast do we have to operate when it comes to the social media aspect of information in our special forces groups? Where should the authorities lie? Should it be at the lieutenant colonel level, where the commander on the ground in country has the authority to just unleash his keyboard warrior?
Well, two things. On the role of organizations like the Wagner Group, I mean, it's certainly important to put this in the context of the Wagner Group. If you look at its location where it operates out of in Russia, it is co-located with Russian Spetsnaz. So there's a close connection deployed overseas between the Wagner Group and Russian government agencies, whether it's Spetsnaz, GRU, SVR, or even the Kremlin itself with Yevgeny Prigozhin, and they are heavily involved, as you note, in information operations against the French, against us, against local governments in some cases. So I think there's an important need to combat those kinds of information campaigns. Now, how much of that gets pushed down? I think it depends. I do think there's a need to have initiatives at the lower level. It may depend on the concept of operations. There's maybe some con-ops that need to be approved because of their sensitivity at higher levels.
I'm out of time. It just seems to me that with regard to the information war, if you don't move first, it doesn't matter if it's an hour or a week behind, you're out. I yield.
Thank you. Now, since we have two members of the subcommittee with the last name of Jackson, this will be Representative Jeff Jackson. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
I would defer to the doctor. Only one of these Jacksons is a doctor.
Well, I don't know. Would you like to be a doctor?
I'll go and I'll defer afterwards. I just want to ground this conversation real quick. I understand we're having a very high-level conversation, which I gather is basically about reorienting SOF in the great power conflict era into which we appear to be entering. When I think about reorienting a military group, I think in terms of mission, training, and equipment, and that we have to make changes along those three axes. And I'd like you both, if you would, give me a quick glance at mission, training, equipment. Are there major changes that need to be made in each one of those categories? Is it major in one and minor in two others? Do you think we're okay in one area? How big of a pivot are we really talking about on the ground?
I will attempt to answer your question, Representative. It's a very good one. I think in terms of mission, there is a contrast to be drawn between aiding El Salvador against the FMLN in the FID environment of the 1980s and helping a country that's threatened by China. Not only is the adversary a state actor, and a very potent one at that, but the threat of military action is also both more remote and more existential. And so in the mission, we have to probably spend some time redefining what it is that we are fighting for and what victory will look like. How do you know that you're resilient? It's one thing when you're facing an ongoing insurgency. It's another thing when you're facing proxies, auxiliaries, and subversion within your state borders. So again, this is perhaps a less military problem set than a political and societal one. We have to, in a sense, effectively figure out where we draw the line. And I'm sorry that's not a very definitive answer, but I think it speaks to the messiness of the strategy that's being waged against us. In terms of training then, certainly after 2 decades of heavy use of SOF in direct action, it's heartening to see that after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we've seen initial steps of rebalancing and returning to the regional alignment of the special forces in particular, but SOF in general. And that's, I think, a step that we need to continue and sustain so that you have the, again, cultural know-how, linguistic skill set, and political awareness necessary to engage in partner countries and to understand the environment in which you're operating, both human and otherwise. And then in equipment, this is when things get more techy. I think there's been some interesting news in the last few months, which I applaud, talking about the deployment of drones as a particular MOS, the possibility of adding cyber MOSs within Special Operations Forces, and taking the lessons from Ukraine and trying to institutionalize that within emerging force structure. So that would be my initial tack at that question. Thank you.
Great question. Let me just start off by saying that this problem set is obviously not new to the SOF community. Organizations like the U.S. Army Green Berets have a long history of doing irregular activity. So I think this is the shifts are not major in most cases, but I'll give you some examples of I think where. So if we go to mission, probably more of a rebalancing than a big mission shift. The rebalancing is when you're dealing with countering major powers instead of terrorist groups, it probably shift away from how much you're putting into direct action and how much you're putting into foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare, I would argue. The number of direct action missions you're going to want to do when it involves the Chinese government or the Russians is going to be limited because of the risks of escalation. So I think it's a rebalancing on the missions. On the training, I think that is a bit of a challenge because I think you're talking about shifting from special operations forces that have had to work through Dari and Pashto and Arabic in some areas, and now you're dealing with Mandarin and Russian, or if you're dealing with, the Finns or the Baltic states, you're dealing with Eastern European languages in order to, so I think there are some cultural linguistic challenges that SOF have to get through in understanding the partners that they're working with, certainly the case in the Indo-Pacific. And then on the equipment, I would wholly agree. I think the issue is that the French have withdrawn from key parts of Africa, so have we from the Middle East. So I think there you're talking about ISR assets, where we're probably going to need more of to cover a bigger terrain, and the same thing on drones and also underwater activity.
Thank you. I yield to the doctor.
Thank you. And Dr. Jackson of Texas, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time. Unfortunately, I came in with 3 great questions, and they've almost been completely addressed at this particular point, so I'll yield my time back. I thank you.
Okay. Congressman Panetta of California, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I think it was Dr. Jones, you talked about 1202 and Title 333 authority, so let's focus on there. Obviously, 1202 authority enables DoD to support foreign forces engaged in IW, regular warfare. However, once a conflict is determined to turn conventional, that authority is removed, as happened in Ukraine, where 1202 authority is no longer applied. Are there other funding authorities that could be used to supplant 1202 in that situation?
Possibly. I mean, I think there are elements of 333 of Section 333 that could be used for building partner capacity. If there's a counterterrorism component of it, 127 Echo. So there may be other authorities that could be used depending on the circumstances.
But isn't Title 33, that can't be used for irregular, it can only be used for asymmetric warfare, correct?
Well, it's I'm operating in the gray zone here. It kind of depends on how one interprets it. So if a country is, if you want to build the capacity for future irregular activities, I mean, there may be some ways you can define that.
Okay, so I mean, going forward, once you have conventional or asymmetrical warfare, those two authorities are no longer apply.
That's my understanding.
Okay, and is there any other type of authority that could allow us any other type of funding stream?
There may be. I'm not aware off the top of my head.
Okay, would you happen to know, sir?
No, I would provide the same answer, but I would add, if I may, that part of the confusion here is this delineation between irregular and major combat operations. It just doesn't really make sense in reality, and I think that's when we come up to these legislative hurdles with authorities. I would probably prefer to speak of war as war in all its complexity, but we are where we are. But that might be one of the issues confronting us at this point.
Understood, and one I'm sure we'll talk more about in this committee, I would imagine. Moving on to Africa, obviously, as you heard from my travel partner over there, Representative Scott of Georgia, we've taken a couple trips to Africa, actually 3 total, 2 to the Sahel. Obviously, seen some unfortunate developments that have gone on there, not just with the spread of VEOs and obviously the influx of Wagner, be it in the Central African Republic, Mali, and possibly Burkina Faso, based on some of the flags we saw at the coup, creating a lot of instability, pushing out France, and obviously having military governments filling that vacuum that are openly sympathetic to Moscow, unfortunately. I know, I think, Mr. Scott, Mr. Jones, you talked about there has been a withdrawal from Africa. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say a withdrawal from Africa, because if you look at Chad and you look at Niger, I believe Niger is kind of the Alamo. That's what I call it, in the sense that, you know, you saw the French forces go there after leaving Mali. We have our forces there, either in Diffra or Wallam, or right there in the capital city. I mean, do you believe that we can hold the Alamo based on the situation that we're facing right now?
It's a very good question. By withdrawal, my only comment there is when it comes to U.S. Special Operations Forces in Africa, the number has decreased over the last couple of years. So we've withdrawn some numbers. And the challenge when you look at the Sahel with groups like JNIM, some of the areas of North Africa, including in Libya or even in the Horn with Somalia, is we're seeing pretty significant activity of violent extremist organizations. I think the situation in the Sahel is extremely dangerous right now with the spread of both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State linked groups operating. On the one hand, it's a spreading right now, and we've got now Russian Wagner Group and Russian intelligence agencies linked up. On the other hand, I'm not aware of much external plotting going on against the United States from these areas. So, you know, it's different. It's a different situation from Syria, where we've seen external plotting in the West from areas of, so I think it's an area of monitoring closely. We need to be involved to some degree. How much, that's an area of debate and discussion.
Understood. Look forward to having that debate. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Mills of Florida, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for coming. In understanding this is about the great power resurgence, if you will, and knowing the geopolitical alignments now of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, I feel that the United States for many decades now has been very good in the kinetic elements of things, but we have failed to address a lot of the economic resource and cyber warfare capabilities that we're against. In many cases as well, we're seeing where there is an increase in the capability of messaging strategies and propaganda information warfare against the West, whereby we don't have an effective counter-messaging strategy to be able to prevent this. From your perspective, would you see fit more allocations of funding that would address the geopolitical alignments as opposed to just the kinetic elements of things?
Absolutely. And I think this goes back to our discussion both on amounts of funding, but also the speed with which we respond. I mean, I think the Chinese also, we talked about Africa and the Russians, the Chinese are a very good example. Their entire 3 warfares campaign involve, all of them are non-kinetic, all of them involved information, and all of them are aggressive, is in part, along with bribery and corruption, how they got into the Solomon Islands, which is, for anybody that's read our World War II history, including our Marine Corps history, we fought tooth and nail against the Japanese there. So now the Chinese have moved in. We lost that information fight in the Solomon Islands. So I think the funding side as well as the speed with which we respond are important.
And just kind of following up on that same tone, and obviously this is information I'm aware of, but I just want it for the chamber. Knowing that it's an economic resource warfare that's been launched against, and it is one of Chairman Xi's primary focuses to try and expand out the Eurasian border, which is what I believe Ukraine was truly about. Take Africa, Oceania, with an attempt to try and create a maritime silk route to choke off Western Hemisphere supply chain while dominating resources and attacking things like the petrodollar for the ultimate goal of U.S. dollar elimination. Do you feel that the State Department, the DoD, and other elements work well together in addressing all of these complex issues when they are so diverse and just outside of the soft kinetic capabilities?
I would offer, thank you for that question, Representative. I would offer that we don't have a strategic framework or guidance at this point with which to synchronize and integrate those respective agencies and departments.
And do you feel that's something that's needed?
I would very much say so. I think a looming question in this era is who actually sets the strategy? Where are the structures where you have that level of interagency integration? Certainly at the country team, great things are done, but that's within specific countries rather than as a nation. So this, I think, is an area of urgent concern and one that I think we should certainly keep moving.
And Dr. Jones, in your testimony, you mentioned that the Department of Defense does not use all the funds appropriated to it by Congress for IW activities. In what ways would you recommend Congress play a more active role in ensuring that DoD maximizes its capabilities in this area to counter the very real and very heavily invested war being waged against our country by our adversaries?
So my comment was not that it's necessarily being used inappropriately. It's more that there is a focus predominantly, and there needs to be a focus to some degree on the conventional side of warfare. So we need to build our F-35s. We need to build our Virginia-class and Columbia-class submarines. We need to build our B-21. But the problem is, I think, at least in my view, some of our funding for irregular warfare activities. We're not asking for a lot of money. I mean, they're not very costly, but they're pretty low right now. And there is, as you're noting, the challenge with the Chinese, I think the problem is bigger than what our national defense strategy highlights, which is a focus on China and the Indo-Pacific. And the reality is when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and you look at China's digital Silk Road, it is global in nature. And it touches key parts of Africa where they're building infrastructure, and there are information campaigns that go along with that. Same thing on the digital Silk Road, which means that I think we've got to also be heavily invested in countering that activity and funding it. So when I talk about funding, I'm talking about some of these sections, 1202, 333, that I think are pretty low right now.
And just really quickly, knowing that it's also a geopolitical alliance that has the Chavez in Venezuela, Pedro in Colombia, and they're developing that kind of iron curtain, if you will, do you feel counter-narco operations would be a very effective thing with combating the fentanyl overdose that's coming across the borders?
Yes, although I'm not an expert on counter-narcotics, but it certainly is a problem.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Luttrell of Texas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
On a cleanup shot? Thank you, gentlemen. I always get very uneasy when the words rebalance and restructure and reorganize soft communities come about. It seems that happens as the war starts to progress. We saw it in the early 2000s as we came in hard direct action missions, and the learning curve was completely vertical. And as we each reached up to the 10 in the early teens, we went into more of a FID where organizations were fighting for work, but still forward deployed. And then ISIS hit. And then we went right back to direct action missions, where it seems like we centrally focused on FID and certain things, but we lost the capability that we should have been hyper aggressive on, but patiently focused. And I hope that's just not the case right now, because SOF builds out a portfolio of all the experiences that we've had over the past 2 decades, and that's something that we need to hold near and dear in case China or Russia clacks off, and we are actively involved in that. But my question to you both is regarding the Tier 1 organizations in Russia and China, how does the American Tier 1 organizations compare and compete?
So I can start there. Look, I think our Special Operations Forces, in my view, are the best in the world, whether it's Joint Special Operations Command or any of the other Special Operations Forces that are within the Department of Defense, and frankly, their partners in the U.S. intelligence community. I think where we do not have, we're not as well organized and not as well structured is what I'll call the broader interagency. So that is, we see a fair amount of Chinese activity across the Chinese intelligence, MSS, Chinese PLA, the United Front Workers Department. Same thing on the Russian side as well. That I think we are being outcompeted in the interagency national scope, not on the capabilities of our SOF.
And to your point earlier, it seems to me that we're trying to spread SOF too thin when it comes to these extracurricular activities that the other countries seem to be performing in, where we can bring in civil affairs or the Army units or the Marine units to help us. Does that hold water?
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I try to make in my testimony. There's simply no appetite for regular warfare really outside of SOF. Even the general purpose forces, although I did comment on the SFABs as a very positive step, of course they're oriented predominantly towards conventional warfare. And regular warfare doesn't really translate outside of the Pentagon. And so we don't have a strategic construct, which I think the Chinese Communist Party does have, and I think Kremlin has for this type of competition. Irregular warfare spending does not have to be very high, as Dr. Jones put it, but there's also no proponent for it. And I think that's allowing us to compete at a more suboptimal level than we should be.
Okay. I'm fairly familiar with the Russian Spetsnaz capabilities, not so much on China. How does that look?
Chinese capabilities of their Special Operations Forces I would call mediocre. Where they are high profile is in areas outside of PLA Special Operations Forces. So, for example, offensive cyber operations and espionage along those lines, reasonably competent. Those are probably the areas where in my view, the Chinese are reasonably competent, but not in the Special Operations.
They don't define their SOF like we define our SOF with direct action, aggressive.
And
warfare.
they don't use them in the same way. Our Special Operations Forces have had several decades of experience conducting direct action, unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense. So we know how to do a lot of activity. Chinese are not. Again, on the irregular warfare side, the Chinese are able to use a range of different agencies in conducting action.
I yield back. Thank you.
Ranking Member Gallego, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me one more bite at the apple. And it's kind of following up on Congressman Luttrell's question a little. How much and what did we learn from the last 20 years of Special Forces operations, which were largely dominated by CT-like missions, and how did it prepare us for irregular warfare? I mean, there's the downside, but there also should be some of the lessons that we can carry over. And it's for both witnesses.
I think what we've learned in the last 20 years, and it really come on the back of the information technology revolution that started in the 1990s, perhaps even 1980s, is that SOF, equipped with that technology and having the training and education that they do have, can achieve amazing things through direct action, but also very sensitive clandestine operations. The broader strategic lesson, however, I think comes from places like Colombia, places like the Philippines, where we see FID missions being conducted on a protracted basis through partnerships with the host nation government. And in comparison with Afghanistan and Iraq, albeit in a very different strategic context, Philippines and Colombia, I think, points to a way forward for FID and for the special operations community. What does that mean? It requires then a political engagement. It requires an enduring partnership, trust, and those things, of course, cannot be instantly manufactured. But it also requires different instruments of state power to make sure that the operational gains can have a strategic meaning. So I think 20 years of war on terror, those are some of the key lessons that I would take away from SOF activity.
But I would say what we can do well is if we need to hit a target in a specific location, we can do that quickly, and we can do it probably better than, not probably, better than anybody else in the world. So we can do direct action extremely well. I think we can generally train foreign forces relatively well. We did it in Colombia. We've done it with the Iraqi counterterrorism services. But there are limitations to what that means. You can't rebuild a government that way. You can't nation build. So by training key partner forces, it doesn't mean you win in that case. We struggled in Afghanistan despite the fact that the commandos were a phenomenal organization as part of a broader government that was collapsing. So there are limits to what I think you can do with these activities if you don't have it. The other thing that I would just add is I think we hopefully have learned that the answer to dealing with challenges is not to flood a foreign country with large numbers of American forces. That as I think we finally got to a point by 2017, 18, 19, 20, where a small number of both special operations and conventional forces working with an indigenous force, the Syrian opposition, could retake territory on the Syrian side and on the Iraqi side. And I think that was a much better way to end those 20 years than the way we started by 100,000 plus in both countries. We ended up, I think, largely getting it right at the end.
Thank you. And I know we're going to call votes here in a couple of minutes, but, Dr. Jones, just how would you ideally delineate SOCOM's core activities between the component commands, TSOCs, JSOCs to compete in irregular warfare and continue the CT mission?
Well, I think U.S. Special Operations Command, generally does not own its forces when they go to the combatant commander, so it's got a coordinating function with combatant commanders. But I think it does have a responsibility. It's got to help equip those forces. It's got the responsibility to help and work and train with U.S. Army Special Operations Command, with Navy SEALs, with WARCOM to help train, and then with the TSOCs to help manage the role of special operations globally in the combatant commands. So it's got a very important role in preparing for and then supporting combatant commanders in the use of special operations forces. But really, without SOCOM and without a major role, special operations community breaks down into Army SF, into Navy SEALs. So it provides really the overarching umbrella for the train. And then it also has an important role, I think, on the personnel side in pushing for how well the forces are dealing with PTSD, with suicide, with a range of those. SOCOM's got a very important component of that as well.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Ucko, in your written statement, you equate FID and UW to resilience and resistance, respectively. How have resilience and resistance evolved in the 21st century, especially with the expansion of cyber and information space?
Thank you. So the main change, I think, from what we saw during the Cold War is that the threat is no longer primarily military. And of course, it was the military nature of the threat that brought SOF into the scene. Defending, again, El Salvador or supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is a very different enterprise when you're looking at the strategy that China and Russia are now using. So that brings in new capabilities that have to be sharpened, whether it's countering threat finance, countering disinformation. And the question for me is to what degree SOF really ought to be taking the lead in those particular areas. So while we speak of FID and UW, really have to bring in other agencies and expertise to that portfolio. Doctrinally, that is anyway recognized. I think it's also recognized within SOF's emphasis on partnerships and working with them through their interagency. But it does perhaps run up against a tendency to press what one former Assistant Secretary of Defense called the SOF easy button. That is to say, to delegate things to the Special Operations community because of problems being unorthodox and no one else is around to solve them. I think that is fighting this competition with one arm tied behind our back. And so we have to probably instead broaden what we mean by resilience and resistance to bring in the relevant civilian capabilities that can give us strategic purpose.
Okay, thank you. You know, I want to thank everybody, our members and our witnesses for, I believe, getting our 118th Congress subcommittee off to a great start with a presentation of ideas, thoughts based on experience, both your experience with all of the members here, experience to bring us into the reality of where we are here in 2023 and going forward. And I think since we're the first two wolves, Romulus and Remus, life has been a competition for resources. You find that carcass on the road, you're gonna tear it apart and you're gonna fight for what you want. And when we look at what we do as members of Congress in allocating funds, understanding which authorities exist and don't exist, and how it relates to the future resources that we're going to need, and then understand how we as a congressional committee do the right thing then to enable the Department of Defense to do what it needs to do. We have to be very careful in life that we don't fight yesterday's war or use yesterday's, in my case, I'd love to be able to use just yesterday's phone and make it work, but we know it's going to change. But the point is, as a committee, we're going to work through this, and we're going to test areas where we're not comfortable, and we would hope that all of the services, all of our subject matter experts who come from the different communities will run with us, and we will run together and figure out ways in the next 2 years to do the right thing for the defense of our nation through our special operations, through our irregular warfare, through the recruiting, training, and sustaining of the MOSs that we're going to need to win the next fight. So with that, unless there's anything else, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Audio check, 1, 2, 3. Audio check 1, 2, 3 from the hearing room.
Mic check 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2.